Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, and this is going to be our second installment of Evolution of Civilizations, which is going to be particularly about the 7 stages of civilization. So, Nima, after our last discussion of civilizations, are you excited for this one? Absolutely, can't wait. Awesome. So, a quick recap. I wanted to go over what we went over last time, because it was some pretty dense stuff. So, we're reading from Carroll Quigley's book, The Evolution of Civilizations, and we did a quick bio of who Carroll Quigley was in the last show, so I'm not going to do it again here. And the book makes an effort to apply the scientific method to historical analysis, with the goal of being able to turn history into a practicable subject. And so the core driving force behind historical development, according to Carroll Quigley, is what he terms instruments versus institutions. So an instrument is an organization that a society puts together to achieve a certain goal, and that instrument will experience and to achieve a certain goal. The example we mainly focused on last time was like, an army has the goal to defend a society, or maybe the mint has the goal to create money for everybody or to employ everybody, or do you think of any other? The public school system is supposed to have the goal of educating the children. Things like this. These are all instruments.
Yeah, the medical establishment is supposed to make us healthy, apparently.
Right. So now, you're already hearing the sarcasm in our voices about these institutions, or these instruments that we're bringing up, because every instrument will experience 3 main problems. So the first problem is, each person takes as his purpose the fulfillment of his specific duties within the organization. But this leaves no one in the organization with the duty of making sure that the organization fulfills its purpose. This totally makes sense. Obviously, if I get a job inside a big government agency, if I'm working for the military or something, obviously, me as an individual am not responsible for defending the nation, and I gotta, focus on the job that I'm given. The second problem is every member of an organization is obviously human, and therefore has human weaknesses and ambitions. So each person in an organization naturally seeks their own advancement or advantage, seeking promotions, better pay, better assignments, etc. And these acts will eventually absorb more and more of the time of the organization's members. So instead of me focusing on the real goal of the organization, I'm focusing more on things that benefit me. The one that just popped into my head is Boeing, actually, because I live near Boeing, and it seems like every other person who lives here works at Boeing, and it's kind of a joke about how much time they spend doing nothing on the floor, and like how much free stuff that they'll take home, and everybody's looking for their pension. Everybody's kind of looking to get what they can out of the company, where the purpose was supposed to be build airplanes. So this slowly decreases the organization's effectiveness at achieving its original goal. The third problem is that social conditions will always change. So when this happens, the organization must adapt to the changed social conditions in order to maintain its effectiveness. But the members of any organization generally resist such adaptation and have become vested interests. I mean, we're all familiar with this term. And it goes hand in hand with part 2, which I said, where, everybody's seeking to improve their own situation within the organization. And as we went over last episode, these interests can become so vested that the people inside of them will refuse to change even in the face of millions of deaths, as we saw in examples from World War I, particularly things like the cavalry, who would, for 4 years, just consistently charge into the onslaught of machine gun fire, and the entire time dying and insisting that, the cavalry are the people who are going to win the war. So, due to these three factors, an instrument will eventually become an institution. Again, this institution are Quigley's terms, where a societal organization dedicates more energy and effort to perpetuating its own existence than it does toward achieving the goal it was created to achieve. And this is the the big deal about the book. Quigley maintains that all societal instruments, from the military down to football. Yeah, he even has like a 5-page part detailing why this also happens to football. Follow this pattern, and that this pattern is the most fundamental force which drives historical development. And this pattern is the application of the scientific method to history. This is the like most fundamental rule that we can look at, and its importance to the subject of history can probably be compared to the importance of Newton's laws of motion to the subject of physics. So what we're going to do now is we will be applying this universal principle of history, instruments versus institutions, to the development of our favorite type of society, which is a civilization. Nima, did I miss anything important from last episode that you wanted to make clear before we dig in?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, great. So we're going to get into the topic of civilizations, and of course, the first thing that anybody should be asking is how we're defining what a civilization is, because it's not clear. And even though it's not clear, all you need is a cursory glance at history to see that there's something that we're using the term civilization to describe, and a lot of us think of like the Romans or the Sumerians or the Chinese or the Indian civilizations and these sort of things. That this vague idea that we haven't really defined yet go through a life and death cycle. And many historians come up with reasons for why this is the case, but according to Quigley, most of these explanations are unsatisfactory. And then quickly, I just want to give a reminder. Essentially, I'm going to be repeating what I've learned from this book with some side commentary from me and Nima about what our opinions of that might be, or what are some examples that we could think of. So when I'm going through this information, largely this is the opinion of Carroll Quigley. Most of it, after reading it, I agree with. And I think, Nima, do you agree with most of what we've been going over so far?
Yep, no doubt.
Per Quigley? So I'm going to be talking a lot like this. This is my idea. Assume it's Quigley's unless I say otherwise. So the problem of defining civilizations has been attempted to be answered by many historians, and they come up with many reasons why civilizations go through this life and death cycle. But most of these explanations are unsatisfactory. And the biggest example that Quigley points out, and that I've heard from other historians, is what Quigley is calling the softening fiber theory, which goes something like this, which is hard times make great men make good times make soft men, and soft men make hard times. Now, this sounds great, but it doesn't give any real explanation of the process of change that the civilizations go through. And at this part in the book, Quigley gives several examples of writers who have different ways of painting this softening fiber theory in different words. and none of them really offering any real explanation. And if you want to go look at them, I'd recommend going and reading the book. But the one writer that he does point out, who says, in his opinion, got a little bit closer, is Arnold J. Toynbee, whose explanation for the life and death cycle of civilizations was that Toynbee attributes the rise and fall of civilizations to the challenge and response to the struggle for existence. Now, this gets a little more interesting, but as Quigley points out, that Toynbee still fails to address why a civilization, which has been successfully responding to challenges, suddenly ceases to do so and decays. And one of the issues that he brings up is that most historians, the issue that Quigley brings up, not Toynbee, most historians look at classical civilization, which at this point we'll call it the Greek/Roman civilization from antiquity, as their only example. Whereas Toynbee looked at about 24 civilizations, which he claimed were the only civilizations to have ever existed on Earth, according to the evidence that we have, and which is roughly the same number as Quigley. We'll be talking about a lot of these different civilizations through this episode and quite a few others. So Quigley's explanation is obviously a bit more complex. That's why we're making multiple episodes about this, is that civilizations go through 7 stages resulting from a civilization's instrument of expansion of eventually becoming an institution. I want instrument of expansion to be bold in your mind when I say that sentence. And obviously we have to talk about what an instrument of expansion is. So an instrument of expansion is follows the same protocols as the instrument that we described in the previous episode and in the intro to this episode. However, the instrument of expansion is a societal organization that has 3 distinct parts. The first part being that a society must organize itself in a way that it has an incentive to invent and new ways of doing things. The second part is the society then must be organized in a way that somewhere in a society there is an accumulation of surplus. And finally, the society must be organized in such a way that the surplus which is being accumulated is being used to pay for or to utilize new inventions. So taken together, these 3 things are an instrument of expansion. So we're going to consider a society which has developed an instrument of expansion to be a civilization. This is our definition. Any society which has developed an instrument of expansion meets the criteria for civilization, at least a la Quigley and a la Dylan and Nima, for the sake of this episode and this podcast. These 3 steps of the instrument of expansion can be more simply put as an incentive to invent or invention, accumulation of surplus or savings, and the application of surplus to new invention, which is investment. And Quigley makes an interesting note here that I think is worth pointing out, that students often have a difficult time understanding incentive to invent. And I'm guessing he would know because he was a professor dealing with students' interactions. He says that students assume societies are equally inventive, or that necessity is the mother of invention, or that invention is a hereditary biological talent. And according to him, none of these are true. Examples being Mesopotamian and Western civilization were very inventive, whereas Egyptian civilization, and by Egyptian civilization I'm talking like pharaohs and pyramids and stuff, Egyptian civilization was very uninventive. Furthermore, the adage that necessity is the mother of invention cannot be true. Otherwise, people who are pressed down to the subsistence level would be very inventive. Obviously, if what he's saying here is that people who are either barely getting their basic needs met or not quite getting their basic needs met. The fact that many people around Earth don't invent a better way to get themselves out of those positions clearly means necessity can't be the mother of invention. He also points out that if invention were a result of hereditary biology, then why did China go from a very inventive society to a very uninventive one? And he also points out that the Western civilization, which is the civilization that we're living in, was very inventive for the most of its existence, except for what he said the last 150 years in 1961. So either it's changed since then, which is worthy of discussion, or we could change that 150 to 200 years. So Quigley claims that inventiveness depends on the way society is organized. So Mesopotamia before 2700 BC, China before 1200 AD, and the West for almost its entire lifespan were organized to encourage invention. For the West in particular, the price-profit motive was and has been a massive incentive for entrepreneurs to invent, obviously. However, contrast this to Egyptian civilization, and again, by Egyptian, I'm talking pharaohs and pyramids time. It was organized on the fact that a deity described exactly how everyone should behave, live, and act, and that this organization shouldn't be changed. So obviously, this situation would leave very little room for inventiveness. Likewise, slave societies, like classical civilization or even the southern United States pre-Civil War, have very little incentive to invent either, because slave owners don't really see a reason to make their slaves less valuable by inventing things to replace them. And I also think that in slave societies, the slave owners aren't, because they're not aware of the work required to do something, it doesn't occur to them to think of a better way to do it. So specifically with the South is a very damning example of how a slave-owning society is very uninventive, because the South was very uninventive during slavery, even though the North, literally in the same country, just up the road a ways, was going through possibly the most inventive phase in human history. It wasn't just like more inventive than its neighbor, or like the most inventive in any phase in Western civilization. It was possibly the most inventive phase in human history. So it's important that a society is organized to invent, which was step one of the instrument of expansion. Step two is the accumulation of surplus. And Quigley points out that this is possibly the most important of the three steps. So what this means is that some person must acquire more wealth than they can use in a short span or for their immediate consumption. And that this is so important that it means that some people must have more than their needs of immediate consumption, even if others don't have enough. So, for example, if we had 100 people in a society, and these 100 people were able to generate 100 meals a day, and each person is able to subsist off of one meal a day, and every person is given that one meal, then in this society, there's no ability for anybody to invest, or to save in order to invest into invention, because no one has the spare time. Everybody is living exactly at a subsistence level. But if we take these same 100 meals and we give 25 of those people a meal and a half a day, 50 people get one meal a day, and 25 people only get half a meal a day, these first 25 people would have the excess to allow them to invest into new invention, even if there's 25 people in the society who go hungry as a consequence. So, with this ability to save, even if only a small section of the population is able to do it, this makes it possible for the whole society to increase its production, in this case, of meals. And this is what we'd call the third step, investment. So Quigley has an interesting example here, which is to for investment, which is to imagine a savage. I know we're not supposed to use that term anymore, but I guess it was still cool in the 1960s. Imagine a savage who lives a solitary life, and he survives by throwing rocks at rabbits. And he's able to kill one rabbit a day, and let's say he needs one rabbit a day for basic subsistence. I think it's clear to understand that in this situation that the guy would never have enough time to improve his situation because he's just spending his whole time hunting rabbits all day. Now, if this savage were for some reason be lucky enough to kill a deer, and let's say that deer gave him 12 days worth of meat, that would essentially give him 12 days worth of leisure time. And if he were to say spend that leisure time making a bow, and or a bow and arrow, if that bow and arrow allowed him, after the deer meat was gone, to kill 3 rabbits a day, he's now in a better position where, with the killing of the rabbits, he can have the leisure time to invest into and invent more things. So one of the things that I found fascinating reading through these passages of Quigley's book is that what he describes here with these 3 steps is the strictest definition of capitalism I could think of. Did that occur to you, Nima, when hearing that?
Well, I mean, what occurred to me is basically that when he talks about savings, what that means to me is that there has to be a monetary system. And when he talks about investment, what that means to me is that there has to be people who direct resources towards the building of capital goods. And so everything we've said here, I mean, you just gave those examples of, the savage, and there's also sometimes people give the Robinson Crusoe example.
Right, it's silly. It didn't actually happen like that.
Yeah,
right.
I think those are attempts to make the monetary system look more natural than it really is, because the monetary system is always imposed from the top down on the people, and in part, in my opinion, you just mentioned it. I think one of the core reasons for the monetary system is so that certain groups of people can accumulate surpluses. Even
if others don't get enough.
Yeah. And that's just, a feature of capitalism as well, accumulating surpluses, etc. But it's much broader. I would say it's just a feature of the monetary system. And, then the first factor, the inventiveness, I don't obviously know what leads to that, but as you said, Quigley suggested it's the way society is organized, which I think is plausible. So basically, I guess he's saying that society has to be designed for inventiveness. It has to have a monetary system, and it has to have investors in order to expand. I also wanted to point out that there's an alternative to this. I don't know if you were going to get into this, but Quigley has a section in Tragedy and Hope where he talks about how, and I quote, "An economic system does not have to be expansive, that is, constantly increasing its production of wealth, and it might well be possible for people to be completely happy in a non-expansive economic system if they were accustomed to it. In the 20th century, however, the people of our culture have been living under expansive conditions for generations. Their minds are psychologically adjusted to expansion, and they feel deeply frustrated unless they are better off each year than they were in the preceding year. The economic system itself has become organized for expansion, and if it does not expand, it tends to collapse." And then he goes into, the investment and savings mismatch, which I guess we'll still get into.
Yep, it's pretty funny because that you read that out of Tragedy and Hope. That's almost word for word what he's got in Evolution of Civilizations.
Yeah.
When we get to stage 4, we're going to be really revisiting that concept, because that is a super duper important part of what's going to be going on in this life and death cycle. getting back to the instrument of expansion. So we just went through these three parts, which is invention, savings, and investment, meaning investment into new invention. Quigley emphasizes that all progress, material and non-material, depend on these three steps working in conjunction. Thus, whenever we say instrument expansion, we mean these three steps working in conjunction. So the instrument of expansion can be any kind of organization. And when Quigley says kind of organization, this is going back to his kind of a rainbow continuum of abstraction, which was the military, political, economic, social, religious, and intellectual aspects of society. So the instrument of expansion can be any one of these six aspects. Examples being, in Mesopotamia, people paid tribute to the priesthood, which accumulated surpluses, as Nima and I have described in previous episodes. This was done through a monetary system. This would be an example of the religious aspect of society being the instrument of expansion. In the Egyptian, the Andean, which most people think of as the Incan, and probably the Minoan civilization, the state was used to create surplus through taxes. This would be a political example. In classical civilization, again, think Greek and Roman, they used slavery to generate surpluses. This again was social. In early Western civilization, feudalism was used, where serfs would supply their knights for protection, who would hold the surplus, and I'm sure this was done through a system of taxation. This would be, I guess, quasi-political or social. And then later in Western civilization, we developed a price-profit system where an entrepreneur would generate surplus, and obviously that's an economic system. So, like always, as we spoke about in the previous episode, an instrument will eventually become an institution, and the instrument of expansion is no exception. Now, specifically, we can recognize this when the rate of expansion slows down in a civilization. This is usually from step 3, which is reinvestment of surplus to new invention, breaks down, but he says that technically it could happen any 3 steps. This breakdown can happen for many reasons, but it's usually because the social group, which controls the surplus, stops using it for new inventions and begins to apply it to what he's calling old things. And this list of old things, he says, quote, to be non-productive and ego-satisfying purposes, such as ostentatious display, competition for social honors and prestige, construction of elaborate residences, monuments, and other expenditures which distribute surplus to consumption, but not to more effective means of production. So I guess if we think of the Egyptian pharaohs building pyramids instead of, I don't know, irrigation systems, that might give a clearer example of something like this. When the instrument of expansion becomes an institution, Quigley says this is where we get the tension of evolution. So, as Nima was just reading out of Tragedy and Hope, people want and expect expansion, and they get adjusted to it not only through generations, but often through centuries. And when we think of people getting people expecting expansion, think of like Manifest Destiny in America in the 1800s, where there was this idea of like, okay, we own this whole continent. God wants us to go out there and take it. It's out there. We got to go get it. Think of colonialism. Europe's mostly known for it, but I mean, even countries like Japan got involved with this. We're the best, and we just got to keep expanding, even if we're going over the tops of other people. Think of Roman conquests, this sort of thing. If people are not better off in quotes, each year than the previous year, or if they cannot give their children more than they started with, then people have a tendency to become bitter, disappointed, and restless. And I was just thinking about what you just read, Nima, about there's no evidence that this has to be the case.
Yeah.
But let's. I think we're going to have plenty of time to revisit that idea again once we get to stage 4.
Yeah. So the expansion can come from any of those 6 sections of society that we discussed last time. Okay. Is it has it occurred in all of those, or
I don't know. Quigley really, I'm sure you've noticed from reading Tragedy and Hope, is really into his graphs where he fits in the ideas that he made up in the book. And he's like, okay, this civilization had this thing that I just made up. And then, when I say made up, I don't mean he's just like fantasizing about stuff. I'm talking about the terms that he has created. But he doesn't actually give a list of, in either Evolution of Civilizations or in Tragedy of Hope that I've seen, of what each civilization's instrument of expansion was and what level of abstraction that you would stick that in.
Right. I mean, because I imagine a society whose element of expansion is intellectual is probably more pleasant than one where it's military.
Yeah.
Or,
I probably would agree. Think Mongols on that one.
Yeah.
So the tension of evolution that we just brought up earlier results from vested interests who control the surplus fighting with the great mass of the population whose personal outlooks aren't that great when the instrument of expansion isn't producing what it needs to be producing. So there are 3 things that can happen at this point, and I think we mentioned this in the previous episode. Once the instrument of expansion has become institutionalized and the surplus is not being invested in a new invention, the first thing Quigley calls reform. So this is where the workings of the institution are changed and they become more or less effective at the goal that they were set out to do in the first place. Apparently, this is very rare, and it's so rare that he didn't even give a specific example, which is rare because he usually does that. The second option is circumvention. This is where the original organization, which has become institutionalized, remains intact, retaining its honors and prestige and typically its income, but its role has been taken away and taken over by the new instrument of expansion, and he says this is much more common than reform. And the third option, which is the worst option, I guess, is reaction, where the vested interests win the battle between the vested interests and the mass populace, and things continue to get worse. And he points out that the clearest case of reform/circumvention is with Western civilization, which has undergone circumvention at least 3 times. He says 3 times, but again, this book was written in 1961. So there's going to have to be some interpretation from you, the listener, and us discussing what happened since then. And I think we may be dedicating a specific episode simply to that conversation. So to go over these 3 different phases. So the expansion dates that Quigley has for Western civilization, and of course these dates are approximate, are from...
Let's define Western civilization real quick.
Western civilization came about from the destruction of classical civilization. So essentially when Roman society collapsed from the Germanic invaders, and the remains of Roman civilization mixed with the new Germanic invaders. And this mixture, and these terms I'm using will be more clear because we're going to be going over these 7 steps of civilization. This mixture is what gave the opportunity for a new civilization to arise. And right. The civilization that came out of this, where we kind of see this fantasy, manor and serfs and knight on horseback, and specifically feudalism, is stage 1, essentially, or phase 1, I should say, of Western civilization.
Yeah, so we're talking something like 450 to 800 AD is the initial period of Western civilization, I guess.
Is that what he's got in Tragedy and Hope?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Roman Empire collapsed or Western part at least collapsed in 468, I think.
Yeah, I think he, because the dates I have right here, for the expansion dates, and expansion is stage 3. Again, we'll be going into this in detail. Expansion date for stage 3, or excuse me, phase 1 of Western civilization is from 970 to 1270 AD.
Yeah, but he also talks about gestation period.
Yep, and the mixture. So I think the dates that you just said fit those dates.
Yeah.
Or the dates that you just said fit those stages.
Yeah.
So the expansion type for these dates for Western civilization phase 1 is feudalism. This is where you have the like we just described, the serfs supplying the surplus to the knight who is theoretically protecting them, and the institutionalization of feudalism is chivalry. This bogged up Western civilization, but it was circumvented starting in 1420, again approximate date from Quigley, until 1650 by commercial capitalism.
Right.
This institutionalized into mercantilism. And the oversimplified version of this is that commercial capitalism, everyone figured out that they could make a lot of money by trading goods. Mercantilism is vested interests figured out they can make even more money by prohibiting people from trading and having regulations and taxes and tariffs and crap. This was circumvented by industrial capitalism in starting roughly in 1725, going to 1929, and I think that's the one date that's not approximate here. Industrial capitalism gets institutionalized by what he's calling monopoly capitalism, which kind of goes the same progression, where in industrial capitalism you had the mass production of goods and people made more money by making more stuff, where in monopoly capitalism, which I think a libertarian or an anarchist would call it crony capitalism, they figure out that they can make more money by restricting the production of goods. So, and is there anything I wanted to go over before we hit the 7 stages of civilization? I guess just to reemphasize what we just said, where the instrument of expansion, which is going to be invention, savings, and investment, is going to eventually become an institution where typically the savings don't get reinvested into new invention, and the society starts to break down, where a small group, what that we're calling the vested interests, in quotes, get more and more of the money, and the great masses, and money being resources and money, the great masses are left with less and less. And the tension between these two, Quigley is calling the tension of evolution, will result in 3 possibilities, which is reform, circumvention, and reaction. Reform and circumvention kind of giving you similar thing, and reaction being where the vested interests win out. And the clearest case, as we were just going over with Western civilization, is the clearest case of circumvention, because at least until 1961, when Quigley wrote these books, Western civilization has undergone circumvention and has created a new instrument of expansion 3 times. So, with this understanding in mind of the conversion of the instrument of expansion essentially to the institution of expansion, we're going to use that to help us understand the rise and fall of civilizations, which go through 7 stages.
Question.
Sure.
You said it's undergone the circumvention 3 times, but we've only listed 2 circumventions as far as
I'm sorry. We've had 3 instruments of expansion, and therefore there was 2 circumventions. Thank you, Nima.
Gotcha.
For pointing out my math error. So the 7 stages. The 7 stages, and I'm just going to rattle them off here really quick, are stage 1, mixture, stage 2, gestation, stage 3, expansion, stage 4, conflict, stage 5, universal empire, stage 6, decay, and stage 7, invasion. And a quick reminder on all these stages, they're all on a continuum. Like we were talking about last episode, all these lines that we're drawing are arbitrary distinctions. They can be cut many different ways. And Quigley argues that if we're going to view and define civilizations using this instrument of expansion concept, that these 7 stages are going to be the most effective way of breaking it up. So let's start with stage 1, which is the age of mixture. So as we were just talking about with the birth of Western civilization being between the remains of the Roman Empire and the new Germanic invaders from the north, this begins with a mixture of 2 cultures, which typically happens on the periphery of societies, and I guess that intuitively makes sense because where else would it happen? Within a society. Now, in the modern day, the rules are a little bit different, but I would say even as much as 100, 200 years ago, within a society, people typically have little choice over things in their lives like diet, how they marry, how they acquire things like shelter, how they raise children, how they worship their deity, etc. You're going to do the things within your own neighborhood. However, on the periphery of a society where cultures mix, there's an opportunity of choice, and there is a mutual interpretation on how these things should be done, because you have at least 2 cultures saying this or that should be done. Quigley points out that this is especially true where intermarriage occurs. So I guess where the 2 societies more or less see each other on an equal enough footing that they'll intermarry. And decisions must be made on which customs to follow, especially as intermarriage raises the huge question of how to raise children. Now, if enough intermixing families make enough similar choices, a new society can arise. And if that new society is productive and develops an instrument of expansion, a new civilization is born. Now, Quigley points out that rarely does this mixture, which is happening all the time, produce a new society. And even more rarely does this production of a new society result in the development of an instrument of expansion. And he says this is so rare that despite the fact that societies are mixing all the time, that there have been roughly 24 max, depending on this how strict we define it, civilizations in human history. And for someone who's noticed this in historical records or reading history, this is why new civilizations are often born on the periphery of older civilizations. So a few examples. Canaanite civilization, which is essentially the Levant, think Syria and Israel and Lebanon, that sort of area. Hittite civilization, which was in Anatolia of Turkey. Minoan civilization, which was on Crete, and these are all very ancient, arose on the edges of Mesopotamian civilization. Classical civilization, Greece and Rome, obviously, arose on the edges of Minoan civilization, which was on Crete. And Western, Russian, and Islamic civilizations arose on the edges of classical civilization. So we kind of see this. It keeps going on the periphery, and the civilizations keep getting born farther and farther away, I guess, from the ground zero of Mesopotamia. So once this mixture occurs and an instrument of expansion is created, we enter stage 2, which is the age of gestation. Now, in the interval between a new society creating an instrument of expansion and before that expansion of it is apparent, this is what we're calling this age of gestation. And by its nature, this stage is really boring because nothing appears to be taking place. This was this 450 to 850 that you brought up, Nima, is that there's not a whole lot of culture to be talking about at this point in time. However, Quigley points out that this is a very important phase of civilization because investment and invention are taking place to set up for stage 3, which is the age of expansion. This is the one that everyone gets excited about. I get excited about because we're expanding, we're growing, we're learning new things. The stage of expansion is marked by 4 types of expansion. The first is increased production of goods and a rise in the standard of living. The second is increased population, mostly because of a declining death rate. Third is an increase in geographic extent, primarily from exploration and colonization. And fourth is simply an increase in knowledge. And all 4 of these things work with each other in such a way that enough resources are being produced that some people can devote time to non-resource production, like we were saying before with the savage throwing rocks at rabbits. Obviously, that's a very unsophisticated method which probably didn't happen. But however it happened that a surplus was able to be created, that someone could have leisure time, this allows them to create art, or go explore, or talk about philosophy, or come up with religion, or develop writing, or any of these other things. Quigley points out that often this period of expansion is also a period of democracy, scientific advance, and revolutionary political change, which makes sense because in order to adapt from a static to an expansive mode of life, something's got to change. As a result of expansion, the civilization gets divided into 2 main areas. The first area is the core, which is what the civilization occupied at the end of stage 2, gestation. And the second is the periphery, which is what the civilization expanded into in stage 3. So we've got a few examples here. So, for example, Mesopotamian civilization, the core was the lower Tigris and Euphrates rivers and river deltas. The periphery ended up being so far into Iran, Syria, and Anatolia. Minoan civilization, the core was on Crete, the island in the middle of the Mediterranean. The periphery ended up being the Aegean Islands, which, the Greek islands, and the Balkan coast, Greece. Classical civilization, the core was Greece, those Aegean shores, and the periphery ended up being pretty much the entire Mediterranean, all of Spain, North Africa, Gaul. I mean, it went up to Britain. I forgot how far into the Middle East it went. Definitely hit Syria and Anatolia. Western civilization, its core was North Italy, France, England, and the extreme west of Germany, and the periphery, as it still exists today, has extended into Eastern Europe, roughly to Poland. It's extended to the Americas. It's extended to Australia, New Zealand. I guess you can kind of argue South Africa.
Yeah. But
it's expanded quite a bit. So while this periphery is expanding, the instrument of expansion in the core is already becoming institutionalized. So the core is becoming increasingly static and legalistic because of the reasons we mentioned before of how an instrument of expansion becomes an institution. However, the periphery continues to expand and often shortcuts many of the developments that the core went through. So a possible example of this would be like the periphery learning writing from the core, which the core took centuries to develop. And the result of this is that in the latter half of stage 3, the peripheral areas become wealthier and more powerful than the core areas. And I think Western civilization, this is very easy to see. That, particularly with the United States, becoming much more wealthy and much more powerful than all of Europe, which is, where we descended from. Eventually, the instrument of expansion becomes an institution for the whole civilization, and the rate of expansion for the whole civilization begins to decline. Now we're getting into stage 4. And to quote Quigley on stage 4, the Age of Conflict, this is probably the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all 7 stages. So the Age of Conflict has 4 chief characteristics. The first is a declining rate of expansion, growing tension of evolution. Remember that tension of evolution is between the great masses and the vested interests, and increasing class conflicts. The third is increasingly frequent and violent imperialist wars. And fourth is growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness amongst the population. I kind of get goosebumps when I read this.
Yeah.
Because it's... I mean, you can't help but think of how these very specifically and explicitly describe much of the things going on in our society and civilization today.
Yeah, no doubt.
So let's talk about number 1 and 2. So we got the declining rate of expansion and increasing class conflicts. So when an instrument of expansion becomes an institution, the tension arises between the vested interests of the society and the populace, which has become adapted to expansion. Again, I think that's important to point out against the point that you brought up earlier. This is a tension arising against the populace, which has been adapted to expansion. Usually this situation is a minority versus a majority situation, but neither side has a clear idea of the problem to provide a workable solution. Again, I get goosebumps thinking about this, because all you got to imagine is, how many grassroots or non-grassroots political ideas that are revolutionary or reactionary or not, that claim to have a solution to how the country should work, versus, the higher classes saying, oh, no, it should be like this. And you kind of have a gut feeling that neither of them have any idea what they're talking about. Quigley says, that's part of the formula. He even states this, and this is pretty wicked. Programs for sharing surplus amongst the masses are worse than useless. It doesn't replace the instrument of expansion, and all you did was just destroy a bunch of surplus that could have been used on invention. I guess so much for the welfare state being a good idea. Because, that's an interesting thing, because I often hear politicians or economists or whatever talk about how it's beneficial for the economy for people to, say, spend welfare checks. Or unemployment checks. Like, the economy's down, let's get the unemployment checks so people can spend. Quigley's just saying, yeah, you might get some temporary respite from that, but you're not fixing the instrument of expansion, and you're just, eating up those 100 meals that we talked about before that could have been used for inventing new ways of developing more meals.
Well, also, you're making people less industrious and more lazy.
Yep. Yes, you are. So, if a new instrument of expansion can come into existence, and he says this is usually accidentally for the reasons that we just described, and is usually by circumvention, then the civilization has the ability to return to stage 3, as we just described with that Western civilization has done, at least twice, earlier. When we talk about number 3 and 4, which was the increasing imperialist wars and the increasing irrationality, the different classes, again, these classes are vested interests versus everybody else, engage in these two things for different reasons. So the masses participate in war, often because it's the only way to overcome the loss of expansion. I guess, which is a fancy way of saying that the military is the only job available. And just to hammer this point home, last week when I was reading through this book and making these notes, I actually saw an article posted that was about the military has been complaining because recently, now that the economy has been getting better, it has resulted in fewer recruits.
Wow.
You think?
They really need They need more people, I guess.
Yeah, they do. But it's funny it's like Quigley gave this general concept, and then I turn around the next day and I find an article supporting it.
Yeah.
So so that's for the imperialist wars. The masses turn to irrationality to compensate for the insecurity of their life. This will often come in the forms such as narcotics, gambling, obsession with sex, often in the form of perversion, a growing number of neurotics and psychotics, and a growing obsession with death and the hereafter. Does that not describe the situation today, or what?
Well, absolutely. I mean...
Can you say the SJW phenomenon, increasing neurotics and psychotics? And then obsession with sex, often in the form of perversion? What about all this gender identity stuff?
Yeah, and people...
Where go ahead.
Well, and then people who are into furries, who are into dressing up as animals or whatever. And I guess just overall, all of this is just disillusionment on the part of the people at large, and them trying to look for new and better ways to live their lives. And like they're asking themselves very fundamental I guess they think they're asking themselves very fundamental questions, but also like the entire New Age movement and the global warming religion and all these things. There's just
the opioid epidemic. The fact that people are turning to drugs.
Right. People are disillusioned.
Antifa.
Yeah. Oh my.
People are really disillusioned.
Guys. Yeah, no doubt.
Nima and I have personal experience butting into Antifa, by the way.
Yes.
So, the vested interests get into wars and irrationality for the reasons that we could all probably figure out, which is they divert the masses from themselves and divert them from the uninvested surplus that they control. So, to ensure this diversion, if you thought you had goosebumps, just wait. To ensure this diversion, the vested interests will create instruments of imperialist wars, instruments of class oppression, and instruments of irrationality. Can you say holy media Batman? I mean, just looking at the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that were totally done under false pretenses. The death toll is above 1 million, at least, from both, if you count up everybody. The population dislodgement is in the millions and millions, and the whole time, our wonderful media was cheerleading it. And they're cheerleading all these irrational concepts, modern ones that we have, instruments of class oppression. We have Silicon Valley. Just in the news this week, Gab got shut down. Nima, you were just telling me before the call, people that you've personally met have specifically gotten their Facebook accounts deleted.
Yeah.
And the conversations that they were having with you are also gone. People are being unpersoned on the internet, which is supposed to be essentially this instrument of communication that was developed. Now it's turning into this institution of communication.
Right.
This is,
out of control.
Out of control and so accurate. It's just creepy. Now, what Quigley says, once these instruments, and I mean, if you say instrument of imperialist wars, that sounds pretty bad. If you say instrument of class oppression, that sounds pretty bad. If you say instrument of irrationality, that also sounds pretty bad. But he says, once these three new instruments become institutions, then that civilization's pretty much had it.
Yeah.
That's kind of the point of no return. And he says these three institutions eventually get so powerful that they will grab hold of the institution of expansion, not the instrument of expansion, that like we're already in stage 4, and we're already in the conflict zone, and the instrument has become a group of vested interests. The instruments that those vested interests create then take over the vested interests, and so that the surplus from the vested interests now goes into feeding the new institutions of imperialist war, class oppression, and irrationality. Think of the university system.
Yeah.
Half of this irrationality crap is coming out of the university system, and it's almost entirely public funded. I mean, even if we look at the public educational system, it is entirely publicly funded.
Yeah. And then the media to boot. I mean,
yes,
media just produces more and more idiots every day, I think. Or feeds them,
yes,
or both. I mean, I guess maybe the school system produces them, but what's coming out of the school system and out of the media, to the people who are in it, they don't see it, I guess. But when you take a big picture, you zoom out of it, it's a horror show.
It is a horror show. Yeah.
It's a complete horror show of irrationality and
class oppression and imperialist wars.
Right. And turning people into completely manipulable input-output robots. And, just no day goes by without the media universally lying to the people. It's incredible. And
so many people buying it. But yeah. I guess that's a topic for another episode. So some examples Quigley gives, because we were just harping over what's going on right now. In Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian priests fell behind the secular kings they had set up to command their armies. In classical civilization, the slave-owning landlords, the original instrument of expansion, were eclipsed by mercenary armies that were formed to carry on imperialist wars. Third, this is very interesting, the Nazi Party, originally financed by German monopoly capitalists, took over these capitalists for their own ends. So as a result of these things, these imperialist wars, I guess just specifically, as a result of these imperialist wars, the number of political units in the civilizations becomes reduced, and eventually one emerges triumphant over the whole civilization, which begins stage 5, which is the Age of Universal Empire. So we're gonna go a little bit example crazy here, because Quigley slaps us upside the head with one of his famous tables, and he didn't have it in table form. I just put it in table form. So
a political unit, is there a fixed set of those, or is it like you just said Sumerian priests are one example of it?
A political unit would be like Germany and France.
Oh, countries, okay.
I mean, in modern day we call them countries. Yeah. But I guess in Mesopotamia there was Babylonia and Assyria and Persia and, man, I don't even remember. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Babylonia in Mesopotamia of several factions fighting. Or say for classical civilization, there were the Greeks, and then and I guess you could even get smaller. There were the Spartans and the Athenians and the Thracians, and then there was the Romans and the other Italians and all these other guys. Mm-hmm. So eventually, a society on the periphery of the civilization will conquer the core. And a society more on the periphery will conquer that one, and a society more on the periphery will conquer that one, where eventually there's a full peripheral society which conquers the whole thing. So here's the examples going through a few civilizations. So Mesopotamian civilization, the core was conquered by Babylonia around 1700 BC, and the entire civilization was conquered by Persia at roughly 525 BC. And he points out that in the middle of this, Assyria, which was peripheral had conquered more than Babylonia had, and then Persia, which was way more peripheral, conquered everything. In classical civilization, the core was conquered by Macedonia, which was Alexander the Great, around 330 BC, and then Rome conquered the whole thing, roughly 146 BC. In the Mesoamerican civilization was conquered by, and this Mexico area, core was conquered by the Toltecs, and the entire civilization was conquered by the Aztecs. He didn't give dates for these. For the Andean civilization, the core was conquered by the Tiahuanaco, and the entire civilization was conquered by the Incas. Cynic civilization, which was essentially China 1.0, was conquered by the Qin, and the entire civilization was conquered by the Han, dates being 221 BC and 220 AD. Chinese Civilization 2.0, which Quigley just calls Chinese Civilization, the core was conquered by the Tang. The entire civilization was conquered by the Manchu, 700 and 1644 AD, respectively. For Indic Civilization, which was essentially India 1.0, he doesn't know who conquered the core, but the entire civilization was conquered by the Harappa, no date given here. Hindu civilization, so India 2.0, core was conquered by the Gupta, and the entire civilization was conquered by the Mughals, dates being 540 BC and 1526 AD. Islamic civilization, he didn't list a core conqueror, but the entire civilization was conquered by the Ottomans in 1300 AD. For Western civilization, phase 1, remember we went over 3 phases earlier, the core was conquered by England, led by Henry V, around 1420 AD. There was no entire civilization conqueror because a new instrument of expansion was created, giving us Western civilization phase 2. The core was conquered by Napoleon around 1810, where we got another instrument of expansion, where the core was conquered by Germany with Hitler, around, or I guess at 1942 AD. And at this point, Quigley goes instrument of expansion in question marks, because at that point, he's saying World War II just ended and I don't have it. Not enough time has passed for me to see what has happened. This is something, again, that we're going to be talking about in another episode. But I'll say, at least here, I personally think a new instrument of expansion was developed. What do you think, Nima?
Well, I don't know if I even agree that Germany ever conquered the core of Western civilization.
Europe.
Yeah, how did Germany conquer Europe?
By taking over all the different political factions. Now, it was an attempt. All these 3 were attempts at conquering. All 3 of them didn't succeed.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's the difference between Western and other civilizations, I guess.
Yes, correct.
But I mean, okay, Germany didn't, there's much more powerful political units like England, France. I guess France did a political shift towards the Vichy French political party. But I personally, I don't really see how Germany conquered the core,
attempted to conquer,
or even attempted to conquer the core. I think Germany was assaulted from all sides, if anything, and defended themselves. But that's just my opinion. So that's
yeah. I was going to say let's discuss that on the later ones. Otherwise we'll get bogged down here, and we're already over an hour. So the obvious question that arises from this list is, why do peripheral states always seem to conquer the whole civilization to become the universal empire? Because the periphery stays in stage 3 longer than the core does, it will often be more materialistic than the core. And then this essentially means that more of their energy is devoted to producing resources, especially weapons, instead of things like art and philosophy and language and religion. And thus they're going to be in greater position to win wars as as the core will hit stage 4 first. Quigley points out that there's some exceptions to this, as there's a few civilizations that were a universal empire from the beginning. Russian, Egyptian, and Minoan civilizations apparently fall under this category because they were always governed by a single political unit. He points out that these civilizations were in quotes, socialistic civilizations, so that might have had, there may be a correlation there. But because of this, because it was governed by one political unit from the beginning, the imperialist wars aren't so prevalent. However, absence of these wars is no absence of stage 5. The civilization still experiences a decreasing rate of expansion, growing class conflicts, declining democracy, dying science, decreasing inventiveness, and growing irrationality. So, whichever way stage 5 is reached, this is interesting, it's often confused as a golden age, simply because the fighting stops. This results in peace and relative prosperity, because things are no longer being destroyed by war, reduction of internal trade barriers, and a common system of weights and measures. But the problem is there's still no instrument of expansion. And the vested interests, I guess at this point, is where they really go crazy. They start building stuff like pyramids, hanging gardens, coliseums, etc. Over-the-top expenditures of surplus that are clearly not going toward new inventions.
EU Parliament.
So, what's that?
EU Parliaments. Just kidding. Go on.
Oh, what do you mean, just kidding? Yes, EU Parliaments. And to quote Quigley, the golden age is really the glow of overripeness and soon begins to decline. When it becomes evident, we enter stage 6, which is the age of decay. The age of decay is a period of 1, acute economic depression, 2, declining standard of living, 3, civil wars between vested interests, and 4, growing illiteracy. Now, I put a little note next to number 3 here. Civil wars between vested interests, because I wasn't quite sure what he meant by this. I'm wondering if this is like CNN and MSNBC fighting each other for dying viewers.
Yeah, or banking and industry fighting each other for a share in the remaining surplus.
I follow you. Yeah. Usually vain efforts are made by legislation to stop wastage. I'm trying to think of a modern example of that. Maybe something like electric car tax credits. This will save the planet. Too little, too late, I guess.
Carbon credits, I guess.
Carbon credits. There you go. So religious, intellectual, social, and political levels begin to lose allegiance of the masses on a large scale, and all you got to do to understand this is just think of Congress's approval rating. It's been single digits since what, 30 years ago?
Yeah, I think it's just a notch below cockroaches or something like that.
And you brought this up earlier. New religious membership sweeps over society. Can you say new age nonsense?
Yep.
Then here's the important part, is that there's now a growing reluctance to fight for society or even pay taxes to support it. Eventually, the civilization can no longer defend itself and will continue to get weaker until an invader comes along to smash it in stage 7. Stage 7 being invasion. So when a civilization is no longer able to defend itself because it is no longer willing to defend itself, eventually an invader will come to end it. So we got another list here, and this one, I find these fascinating. I don't know about you guys listening to this or you, Nima, but I love these lists of very specific historical stuff that backs up these ideas.
It's evidence.
So, I thought this was an Austrian economics club. Can't be talking about evidence around here. So, Mesopotamian civilization, its universal empire was Persia. The invader that destroyed it were the Greeks, which is obviously Alexander the Great around 300 BC. Egyptian civilization, it was one of those socialistic civilizations that already came with its own universal empire, which was Egyptian. Alexander the Great took that one out too. Minoan civilization was its own universal empire, again a socialistic civilization, was actually taken out by Iron Age Greek tribes between 1400 and 1100 BC. Canaanite civilization, again think Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. Its universal empire was the Punic Empire that was destroyed by the Romans between 264 and 146 BC. Classical civilization's universal empire was the Romans, which was destroyed by invading Germanic tribes from 350 to 550 AD. Andean civilization, whose universal empire was the Incas, was destroyed by the Spaniards around 550 AD.
1550.
What's that?
1550 AD.
Thank you very much. Yes. Spaniards went back in time to battle the 1550 AD. Mesoamerican civilization, again, this is Mexico. Universal empire was the Aztecs, destroyed by the Spaniards around the same time. Chinese civilization, whose universal empire was the Manchu, was destroyed by Europeans between 1800 and 1930 AD. Hindu civilization, whose universal empire was the Mughals, was destroyed by European civilization between 1500 and 1945 AD. And Islamic civilization, whose universal empire were the Ottomans, was destroyed by European civilization between 1770 and 1920 AD. And if we keep in mind that Spaniards are pretty much a part of European civilization, Europe kind of has the... What's that?
Europe wins.
Yeah, Europe wins. Europe's got the high score here.
But I had a question.
Which is...
So Chinese civilization then ended in 1930, according to Carroll Quigley. So then what has China, what has the landmass been since then?
So Quigley actually argues, and he did this in the material that we covered in the previous episode. I just left it out because there was so much material I had to leave something out, but it's good that you brought it up now, is that Chinese, Hindu, and Japanese civilization, Quigley, and again, remember he's writing in 1961, it says, it looks like these guys are forming a new one.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think you can apply this to Russian civilization as well, since the fall of the Soviet Union. However, for Islamic civilization, I don't know what to say. Yeah. I don't see any evidence of a new civilization coming out of it. Just more and more fighting.
Right.
But yeah, there seems to be a China 2.0, an India 2.0, and a Japan 2.0 that are arising from the ashes. And what's interesting, because we've been talking about these rules about and these stages of civilization, and I don't want to get too in depth into this because I think this is a good conversation for the later episode when we try to figure out what's going on in the modern day. Is I think the rules have changed that Quigley has put here in the modern day, particularly because of modern weapons, obviously the atomic and hydrogen weapons, modern communication, internet, and the fact that the whole world, every piece of landmass in the world is claimed by a civilization now. There's no frontier to go into. I mean, minorly, I mean, you can call the nation building that's being done in the Middle East kind of frontierism or colonialism, or what the Chinese are doing in Africa, a little bit of frontierism or colonialism. Right. But for the most part, there's no more space.
So the rules have changed in the sense that future invasions don't necessarily have to come from some other political unit or some other country, but from special interest groups that are global and that organize around the entire globe, and that can be stacked with people from all sorts of countries and political units.
Right, particularly if those global institutions are reading this stuff
and writing it. Yeah.
And writing it, right? And that's one of the important things. We're almost done with this episode here, by the way. Getting to the tail end. That's one of the important reasons that Nima and I want to get this information out there, is that this information, and it's a little blackpilling. I'm sorry, because it's so easy to draw the parallels of today to these principles that he's putting forth here, and going, oh my God, we're in conflict. Oh my God. The invaders are coming. Oh my God, it's universal empire is coming. All the stages of bad are here, and none of the stages of good are here. I mean, that's at least kind of the feeling that I had. And I think it's important to emphasize that these processes aren't deterministic. That if we understand what they are, particularly, if we're looking at that line between the stage of expansion and the stage of conflict, where Quigley points out, he says, look, if we can create a new instrument of expansion, we can go back to stage 3. And in the past, this has usually been accidental, because apparently Quigley was the first person to zoom out and draw these principles. But if we understand them and say, okay, look, if we're going to solve problems, we need to address this instrument of expansion, either create it, or the more interesting point that Nima brought up is there such a thing as a society or a civilization that's just happy with its current existence? And if our globalist overlords are reading this sort of stuff and they understand, because as we pointed out last episode, Quigley was the official historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. So these are the globalists making the modern day decisions. They've read his stuff and they're familiar with these ideas, and because they're familiar with these ideas, they can this is a little oversimplified. They can artificially induce them.
Yeah.
Well, if they can be artificially induced, they can be artificially uninduced.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I think so. I think a lot of the stuff we read from high levels, people think, oh my God, they saw this coming, they predicted this, but a lot of these things are just blueprints.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that Quigley came up with this stuff, honestly. I think he had access to some of the most powerful, important archives of information in the world, namely the Council on Foreign Relations and whoever is behind them. And just
that's a good
that
point.
Stuff up to the public. And,
when he wasn't supposed to.
Right. Yeah, well, who knows? Who knows? I mean, these people write this stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They write about their plans all the time. It's not that this is the first time. It's more like for example, Alan Watts says that these people are very legalistic. They want to make sure they put the stuff out that they're going to do. So just for their own, their own satisfaction or feeling better or whatever, they can say, well, we told you.
We told you so. Okay, well, walking back to the old rules, back to the older civilizations, and to the conclusion of this episode, or before the conclusion of the episode, conclusion of the invasion stage. Because civilization is destroyed by an outside society, we go back to a period of mixture and have the chance to start over at stage 1. So examples of this would be, so when the Greek tribes invade Minoan civilization, this lays the groundwork for classical civilization. When classical civilization gets destroyed by the Germanic tribes, this lays the groundwork for Western civilization. And Quigley even has, I should scan this and upload it. So, Nima, if I send you the picture of this, can you upload it to your website, and then we can paste it in the show notes?
Sure.
There's a picture that Quigley has in his book of it's kind of like this family tree of civilizations, where it's essentially which civilization died on which periphery that mixed with which people, which came into a new civilization, and it's pretty interesting to look at it. I recommend checking it out. There'll be a link in it below. So, in the conclusion, there's some final thoughts from Quigley and from us on this chapter. This is what me and Nima were just talking about. Quigley says, this process is not deterministic. People have power and free will, but their actions have consequences. He reemphasizes, early stage 4 has a lot of freedom to reform or circumvent for a new instrument of expansion. A perfect example, we talked about the North and South U.S. Before the Civil War. Well, after the Civil War, the institutionalized textile industry of New England had to reform or die when the modern plants arose in the South post-slavery. Quigley calls this sort of circumvention geographic circumvention. So he says, thus, stage 4 is a period of crises and hope. Or maybe tragedy and hope.
Nice.
I'm wondering if that's what he means by tragedy and hope, because it was never clear to me why he named the book that after I read it.
Interesting.
In theory, he says, stage 5 is not necessary. Stage 5 being universal empire. Stage 4, conflict, could theoretically just go along until stage 6, decay, became apparent. And this is super interesting. Civilizations do not die unless they're in stage 6. Civilizations that suffer from invasion from stage 2 to stage 4/5-ish, even if it affects them greatly, still manage to remain intact. So, for example, even the Mongols, who were able to conquer Chinese, Islamic, Russian, and Indian civilizations, didn't destroy any of them. That they continue to exist for hundreds and almost 1,000 years for some of them. Even though the Mongols, I mean, in some of the cases, like destroyed murdered 90% of the populations. Eventually, the Mongols went native because I think largely because they didn't really have an intellectual and social culture that could perpetuate them beyond settled life. So, Nima, before I wrap this up, did you have any last thoughts?
Probably too many to blurt them all out right this second.
Do you have one favorite of those too many?
You put me on the spot there. I don't think so. I think we covered a vast amount of information here.
Yeah. And I gotta apologize. I know I'm going at like 150 miles an hour here. There's a lot of info in this book. And I totally recommend reading it. I'm skipping out a lot of stuff, and particularly a lot of examples that Quigley goes over. So I highly recommend reading it. Hopefully, particularly once we start looking into more and more specific civilizations, hopefully we can slow down and digest this a little bit more. But that's all for today. And our next episode will be looking at the precursor of civilizations known as the Neolithic garden cultures. You asked me about that last episode. And we'll also be looking at our great-grandfather civilization, which is Mesopotamia. So with that, this has been Amagi, which you can find at the Think Liberty Network at think-liberty.com. And we will be seeing you next time. Thanks for listening.